Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. May I call the meeting to attention? My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute, and it's my great pleasure to be the chairman moderator on this occasion, which is a happy one for us because Jaap Scholten, the author of the book we're discussing, is an old friend of the Danube Institute and someone who has contributed enormously to the understanding of Central and Eastern Europe, and in particular to the way in which great cultures and civilizations of the past have suffered badly at the hands of the last century, at the hands of communists in particular, but it turns out not only at the hands of communists, but at others too. And he is, I think, from the standpoint of anybody who wants to examine dispassionately and fairly, but not, as he explains, objectively, the situation as painful and as complicated as the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He is the ideal person to do it, as you will know from his past writings and experience when you read this fine book, mysteriously entitled, though you'll find out why, Three Bags of Ladies' Clothes and a Sniper. This is an account of the three journeys he made in the first 6 months of the Russo-Ukrainian war. He has since made another 3 journeys, and I hope we'll see the literary results of that in due course. But I think that for the moment, it's for my job is here is simply to step back to ask Jaap to. I'm sorry, I have not done one important thing. I have not thanked one or two people here. And there are so many distinguished people in this audience that too many to shake an orb and scepter at. But I would like to mention in particular Catherine Kydal-Lynn, who is the publisher of the book we're discussing, who has done a great deal of work, successful and important work, in bringing the history of Central and Eastern Europe to the attention of the West. An accurate history, one that pulls no punches, but does not depict an entire country or civilization as retrograde and backward, except when, as in the case of the communists' culture, they deserve it. I'd like to also mention, welcome in particular, Zoltan Nemeth, the first democratic foreign minister of the post-communist Hungary. It's a great pleasure to see him here. I would like to welcome the ambassadors. I see we have several ambassadors, particularly the Dutch ambassador and the Portuguese ambassador here. Now, having done that, what did I say? Oh, I said something. Sorry, Gaius Jens. Yes, I have these flashes of lack of memory occasionally, you know. Anyway, many thanks to everybody here. Let me begin by saying to Jaap, I'd like you to begin your remarks here, Jaap, as you begin the book, which is to say, by explaining how you came to embark in the first of your 3 trips to Ukraine at almost the very moment that Ukraine was invaded by Russia.
Yes, thank you. It was on the morning of the 25th of February last year that I got a call from one of my nieces who's living in Australia, who's married to a Ukrainian, and she asked me if I could help to get family members of him out of Ukraine. And I did not know so much of Ukraine, to be honest. I had been there a few times, but I was not, well, I think like many people in the West, I was not very knowledgeable about Ukraine. So I went to the border the 25th. I went to Zahoin, because that was the place where they expected to arrive. I have to see, is this working? Oh yeah. Okay, it's going really fast now. Yeah, I will show pictures when I can use them to explain something. So this is the very first evening when I arrived in Záhony, at the border between Ukraine and Hungary. And right here, so what you see here, something quite remarkable happened, because it was nearly midnight, and 3 very young boys were walking in the direction of Ukraine with little bags on their back. And they were hitchhiking, so I stopped and asked what they wanted. And they were, I think, 18 or 19, and they said they wanted to go back to Ukraine to fight the Russians. And that was, for me, the first impression of the amazing courage of the Ukrainians. And my own history, I'm a Dutchman, some people here know. I came to Hungary because my wife is half Hungarian. She's the daughter of a Dutch lady and a Hungarian father who, as a young man, was fighting the Russians here in the streets in '56. And then on the 4th of November, when the tanks came, he decided it was better to go. And the next day, the day after, he left walking to Austria. The police was at the door of his parents' house, so he perhaps had not survived if he had not gone. So and in the family, that is a very strong, that is very much alive. It's very strong in the family that he was fighting the Russians. And when I was younger, I was quite left-leaning, like you should be when you're young. But my grandfather was always very worried about the Russians in the Netherlands, and he always had a sailboat with people on it in The Hague, in Scheveningen, in the harbor for 10 years or something, always to be ready to escape to England if the Russians would come. So the fear for the Russians I got from both sides, both from my own family and from my family-in-law, and it is unchanged.
You're very candid with the reader in the book. Almost, I think it's on the first or second page. You begin by saying that you're not a detached or neutral observer, but you are a partisan. And I'll come back to that, what that means later. But what do you mean by partisan, and how does it differ from propagandist?
Well, I don't know how it... Well, I try to search for the truth, at least. So I think that is quite a big difference with propaganda, because I don't think propaganda is searching for the truth. I think searching for the truth is important, because everything is built on that. And but I became in this war, because it never happened before to me, that I became involved in some way. And but I think it has. So it is also by accident, actually, because I went there to pick up this Ukrainian family, and then I started to help them, and I mean the Ukrainians. And well, I actually made 4 trips to Ukraine, because the first time was in March, but that was an illegal one because my wife didn't like the idea so much. So the first time I went in the night, one time a little bit into Ukraine, and then later I made 3 longer trips. The Ukrainians make and still make an incredible impression on me, and that I think that makes me partisan. And it was also connected to a book that I wrote a couple of years ago, Comrade Baron. I researched what happened to the Hungarian aristocracy in Transylvania during communism. And I worked for 4 years on that book. I interviewed about 50 people. And that, because as a Dutchman, I grew up in the Netherlands, it is quite difficult to understand the countries that used to be behind the Iron Curtain. But for me to do the research for that book and to work on that made me understand, I think, better people in former Central and Eastern Europe and who were in the Warsaw Pact. Because living in a free country, it is, and growing up in a free country, it's very difficult to understand what it does to people to live in an authoritarian state.
It's my impression, though, that the work you've done for Comrade Baron does influence some of your reactions to what you saw when you were there. You refer to it in one passage, and you talk about the way in which the Ukrainians, under the pressure of a relentless, unpleasant, vicious war, were doing their best to retain forms of civilized life, behavior, and even dress. You comment on, for example, a particular woman, we'll come back to Julia, who is in charge of a factory, and you're bringing her some equipment to enable the factory to operate. And her first appearance, she appears looking extraordinarily elegant a
little bit like Audrey Hepburn. Yeah.
A bit like Audrey Hepburn, as you say. A famous Dutch reference, that.
Yeah, she's related to my wife. The mother of my wife is the beautiful niece of Audrey Hepburn.
So you do that. Now, I'd just like to move on to the question. I just want to say that, did that experience of writing the book alert you to certain aspects of the conflict, that your knowledge of what the communists had done to that particular group of people in a way that was extraordinarily cruel? Did that, in a sense, was that in any sense an intellectual tip-off guide to things you saw in Ukraine?
Absolutely, because I interviewed many people who were checked by the Securitate on a daily or a weekly basis. And I also interviewed quite a few people who were tortured or who were in prisons under the Securitate. And that made me realize, and I dived a bit into it, how you crush people. And that made me realize also, I think, was it in day 3 or 4 that Gerson was taken in Ukraine? Immediately people were disappearing, and especially people who were like cultural leaders or were in charge. And I realized that it was a repetition of exactly what happened in Romania and in Hungary under the Soviet occupation. I think it's completely the same.
There's another aspect which struck me, which is that Ukraine has become, in some sense, what the Spanish Civil War was for young leftists in the 30s, which is a place where not just political people, but people guided by humanitarian objectives feel they have to go and declare solidarity with. I want to read a passage you write. And remember, you visited several times the border places where refugees were welcomed here, and they have very similar aspects. But here is particularly a lengthy passage in which you talk about what's happening at the Polish border. A vast, well-warmed tent with the words, "Taking down the Chinese Communist Party is the only way to save humanity," written on the side, is the first thing I see. The United Sikhs, with the slogan, "Recognize the human race as one," have wonderfully long beards and turbans, and they fry excellent curly chips, which towards midnight will serve as my dinner. The World Central Kitchen hands out thick soup, oranges, and Easter eggs. The Jewish Agency of Israel has the stand closest to the border crossing. Kadina has a stall with colored pencils and children's toys. At the aid organization SEWA International, Hindustani in origin, dozens of phones can be charged simultaneously, and the Polish Red Cross is bursting at the seams with medicines, toilet paper, and hand sanitizer. There is a separate tent for the reception of pets. Around me are tall stacks of sanitary towels, bottles of water, or cans of milk powder, along with mountains of old clothes. Cubicles containing chemical toilets have been installed here and there. The hum of generators sounds all around. A rotund man from American Acts of Mercy maneuvers a bulky quad bike through the crowd, and an exhausted mother leans on the pram she's pushing westwards as the sun turns sky pink. It's overwhelming, even for me. You then go on to say you're worrying that you're becoming a disaster tourist. But that must have been a very revelatory moment when you were there. And the degree of what I'd call international human sympathy of all kinds is very remarkable.
Yes. Yes, but it also what it made me realize, because there I crossed the border into Ukraine, and I saw, this was I think in the third week or the fourth week of the war or the invasion, and I saw all these devastated people, and it made me realize two things: how all these lives of all these people were destroyed for nothing, and how the West was focusing completely on refugees. And that made me decide, I thought, and also in the newspapers and in the media, in the Netherlands especially, everything was only about the refugees. It was like we had a refugee problem. But I thought the real problem is a Russian invasion. And I thought you have to try to fight the roots of the problem and not the consequences of it. And that made me decide, actually in the second week of the war, that the best thing you could do, the most peaceful thing you could do, was to help the Ukrainian army. And that's what I have done since.
That tends to be the second, towards the latter end of the book, yes. When you take in, well, I'll come back to some of the things you take in. Now, as a partisan, you don't have any doubts for your sympathies lie, as you've just said, really. Namely, they're with Ukraine and therefore very much against Vladimir Putin and Russia, more against Putin than against Russia. You meet Russians abroad and find some sympathetic and almost as victims of Putin as well, because of the way they feel they are disliked abroad and will not be free at home when they return. I wonder if you want to discuss the situation of ordinary Russians in this and why some are victims and others seem to be urging Putin on to further excesses.
Well, again, working on Comrade Barron, on that other book, I realized once an authoritarian state is installed, it is, as a citizen, it is nearly impossible to fight it, because the only thing can happen is that you're tortured and thrown in prison or in a camp. And so I think, for me, Putin and the Russian imperialism is like fascism. And I think you have to try to fight it immediately at the beginning, when you still have a chance to beat it. And that's why I became partisan. And the Russian people, I think, actually many don't have a choice. I mean, now, when you would rebel in Russia, yeah, it means you will be imprisoned. And so I think you cannot win from a system like that. Yeah.
Well, one of the things which is, in a sense, driving you on in the book is that you see the results and you hear accounts of precisely this problem of Russian military aggression and the ruthless imposition of a false new order on the societies he's taking over. Obviously, I have to ask this question. Are you reasonably sure that you were not deceived by Ukrainian propaganda, which, as you yourself rightly say, is bound to be a factor in war on both sides?
Yeah, sure. Everybody is telling the story in the way that he is suiting his things that he wants to reach. But no, I'm quite sure. It is in the end a free country that was invaded by a much bigger force, and I have spoken to people the things that happened there, and it is horrendous. And I have seen how Russia now just tries to destroy everything. So for me there is, and also I think you can see the Russian propaganda and nonsense everywhere, and they are really good in it, to spread it all over the world. Well,
let me just deal with one aspect of that, because you and I essentially are on the same side. We agree on most of the things we're discussing here. But in fact, we are surrounded by people we know, people we love, and neighbors who are amiable and decent people who deeply disagree with us. Now, one of the things that one of the aspects of that disagreement is their account of Russia not as ruthlessly invading a country because, in a sense, the Russians feel they have some kind of historical right and mission to do this, but as responding to a prior Western and particularly NATO aggression that goes straight right to the Russian border, beginning in 1989 and going on until the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What do you say to that? Because that, after all, is the argument you hear not only from Russians or Russian sympathizers, but from American, quote, realist, unquote, political theorists and international relations experts.
Yeah, well, I think I remember, I think it's, what was it exactly? It was in the 1945 that the Pope was had something to advise, he had some idea about how something should be solved. And I think Winston Churchill told this to Stalin, and then Stalin was asking his man next to him in Russian, how many divisions does the Pope have? And I think this is still the way of thinking of Russia. I think the only thing they really listen to is power and nothing else. I don't think they respect anything else. I think they have shown time and time again that you cannot trust them in any way. And so I think power is the only thing that you can put against them. And I think the reason that they hurried to invade Ukraine was that they were afraid that it one day would join NATO. And I think NATO is the only protection for many countries, because that they respect, because it has more divisions than they have.
Yes. Well, obviously, I tend to agree with that, having found it something to try to get all these countries into NATO. But so we're on the same side. But I think there may be people in the audience, in fact, I know there will be, who differ. Let me then get on particularly to the situation of Hungarians. Now, at the moment, both the opinion of the Hungarian government and, as far as one can tell, very clearly, it seems to me, of most Hungarians, is that they are skeptics about the war. They think that they argue for as early as a ceasefire as possible, and they do so in part because they agree with the analysis that NATO and America have provoked this, and they see no way in which the war can end, which is good for, well, it's certainly they don't see a way the war can end favorably for Ukraine. So, in a sense, if it can't end favorably, why not bring it to an end as soon as we can, rather than continue the deaths? What would you reply to that, particularly to the Hungarians?
Yeah, well, to me it is, I don't really understand how many Hungarians could make such a mental jump to be against the Ukrainians and more or less pro-Russian. And well, I have traveled very, very much in Transylvania, so I know the complex relation between the Székely and the Hungarian minority in Transylvania with the Romanian government, and how they are, well, discriminated. And to be honest, I don't know too much about the minority in Transcarpathia. I can imagine that they all were also discriminated by the Ukrainian government. And what I know, because I once did do some research, that many of the aggression that was between the Hungarians and the Ukrainians in Transcarpathia was all Russian organized. So they brought in buses with people who were shouting, "We kill all the Hungarians," and in Uzhgorod, in the cultural center, they twice had Molotov cocktails thrown there, and so the Russians do everything to enemize the Ukrainians and the Hungarians, and they were, I think, very successful in it. And I think, but to have the 140,000 Hungarians in Transcarpathia makes the whole thing more complex. But I think in the same time, the attitude of the Hungarian government does not make their position easier. I think there are also Hungarians living in Transcarpathia who are fighting in the Ukrainian army, and you have even battalions of Hungarians. And I think these are the ones who do a great job for the minority in Transcarpathia, because that will be remembered, and that there will come a certain end to this war once. And I think when the Hungarian government is all the time more working against things that help the Ukrainians, I think it will all the time work against the minority there. So to me, it is completely illogical why the Hungarian government is doing so. But the question was, what did I have to answer?
Well, let me add to the question anyway, to give you another sort of peg. You actually have a passage on Viktor Orban, and it's an interesting one because it draws on the history of Hungary and Transylvania in particular, but also says this: in Western Europe, people love to portray Viktor Orban as evil personified, forgetting that he's brought Hungary and some of the Hungarians a number of good things: stability and economic growth, a reduction in the huge national debt, a restoration of a kind of pride in being Hungarian, a settlement of the personal debts that hundreds of thousands of poorly informed Hungarians had run up in a foreign currency, the rule that a certain percentage of items sold in the supermarket must be Hungarian in origin, and finally, and controversially, of course, the low price of oil and gas from Russia. And you then go on to say, and this is what I'd like you to really discuss further, you compare him to the Prince of Transylvania in the and in the medieval period, Gabor Bethlen, and go on to say the situation of Hungary in geopolitics compels it to be a kind of to do a balancing act. Now, is that the explanation of Hungarian policy, A, and B, can it work?
Yeah, well, if it will work, it also depends who is going to win this war. So when Russia wins, it was a good gamble. But I hope Russia is not going to win this war. And I think also the West cannot let it happen that Russia wins this war. But yeah, I think that Gábor Bethlen was kind of an example for Viktor Orban in the way that it was in the 17th century. How Gábor Bethlen was very successful to play out the Ottomans against the Habsburgs, and made it was a very successful time for the princedom of Transylvania. And because Transylvania was during the Ottoman time, it was a kind of semi-independent princedom. So Bethlen was really good in doing this, but to me, I don't understand. So in a way, I can understand that you try to play this game, because you try to get the best from both sides. But I think it's not always done in a wise way. I would do it more diplomatic, and because me, although I'm married to an Hungarian, I love Hungarians, I love Hungary, I live here, but I feel it a little bit like he's betraying us. I like to know on which side somebody is, and that is very unclear now. And I know that Turkey is taking the same position. I think Turkey is the biggest pain in the ass for the United States because they don't know on which side they are. It's a bigger problem than Taiwan or China, because you don't know where somebody is, and I don't understand. So I can imagine that you want cheap gas and oil, but why to take it so far? I don't understand that.
Well, I think obviously the audience will have things to say about this. Yes. I'll move on to other points. And now, one is the impact of the war on human beings in all its cruelty. A particular cruelty, however, is it does appear that the Russian army uses rape and degradation as a weapon of war, in a way that I hope most European and Western armies no longer do, and have not done for a long time. And so my question would be, what can we conceivably do about that during the war and after it? Because it does seem to me that one of the signs of a decent civilization is that even the crimes it commits, so to speak, and in a way war is a kind of a crime against people, are nonetheless contained within civilized restraints and standards. And if the accounts of what happened in the town of Bucha and elsewhere are to be believed, and I think obviously you believe them, and I tend to as well, don't we have to really think hard and long about how we discuss this with the Russians when, as will presumably happen, the war finally ends?
Yes, yeah, well, I think this whole war is a wake-up call for all of us. So I think we lived a very long time in a false feeling of security that was based on nothing. And in that sense, I think Europe woke up, and now it should take the consequences and build up a defense and everything. And because I think the whole of Europe now can produce the ammunition what Ukraine is using in a month. In a year time, they can produce that what they use in a month there. So we have to change our whole apparatus for it, and Russia is doing that already. It's completely a war industry, and that's also the scary part, that we cannot compete with that. But so we have to think on a long term how we're going to organize that. And well, the other thing is when this war, but it will be, I think, extremely difficult when this war ends. Is there any punishment for all the rapes and torturing of civilians?
It's very hard to see the punishment side of it, I agree. But we should remember really that the Congress of Vienna in 1815, which is some time ago, which included the Russian Tsar, did agree on abolishing slavery. Now, they didn't get around to doing so for some long time, but nonetheless, that's something which one can recall as being a factor we should deal with in the war. I mean, in any peace, because presumably there will at some time be a peace. Now, let me turn to another aspect of human behavior. I visited once the Warsaw Uprising Museum in Warsaw, and I sat in the reconstructed cinema and watched the film broadcasts of the uprising, which were actually filmed by the revolutionaries, by the rebels themselves, and then rushed to the cinema and watched by audiences who were just a mile away from the actual slaughter. And one of the most affecting scenes was a scene of a marriage between a young soldier, 21 or 2, in fatigues, and his bride, all in white. And I mentioned this, and my guide said, "Oh yes, there were many marriages during the uprising." And you found the same thing in the war, didn't you? And I wondered if you'd like to talk about that.
Yeah, there are many marriages. I think, well, everything is very intense, but it is also, I don't know who has been lately in Ukraine, but in Lviv and Kyiv, the life is also very alive. So you have a lot of people on the streets, and there's clubs, and I think because death is so close, life is very intense. But I think, and I did not research it, but I can imagine that the high level of soldiers marrying also has to do with insurance, that when you're married, when you die, there is some kind of insurance money. I don't know, but I could imagine. But I think everything is intenser. But it was also, the last time I went there, I went to Chernihiv to bring helmets and things to doctors in the military hospital there. And I went to a little village where the Russians had been for a month, but there had been fighting, but the Russians put their tanks in between. It was a village of, I think, 200 houses or something. And I visited a family, and they were put with 38 people in a basement for 1 month. And they were living on potatoes, and there was fighting above them. But then there was a young girl who was pregnant, and she gave birth with all the 38 people in a very small basement. And she called her daughter Victoria. And I think there is all the time in this very dark times this optimism and this spirit to fight.
In fact, you went also to several military funerals, and I think they're powerfully described in the book, and particularly, of course, both the grief and the stoicism of the people at the funerals. It was my impression reading you, I wonder if I'm right here, that in a sense these funerals are, for the moment at least, a major factor in the determination of the Ukrainians to continue fighting.
Yes, well, I think the Ukrainians have no choice than to fight, because otherwise they they will destroy it anyway. And but I remember it was not something I read about it. I did not hear it from this woman, but a woman who lost her young son, and her reaction was that she could be proud and that she could, with a straight back, walk through the village. So this amazing that when you lose your child, that you even you can say something positive about it. I mean, it is for me, it is
yes,
incredible.
I want to, before I get on to some of the remarkable people you met, I just want to read your description of packing for your second or third journey, I think. Now, at this point, you are bringing a lot of equipment in, both, I think, for the army, but for civil society to enable it to keep going. And you write, I'm a novice in a war zone, which doesn't alter the fact that a few days ago, when I was packing things in my Hungarian village, I naturally thought about what it would be useful to bring with me. I've never been in the Boy Scouts, and were you to look at what I've packed, you'd almost think I was trying to make up for the fact in the autumn of my life. I'm not. It's just that I wanted to be able to cope as well as possible. That was my packing logic. A garden hose with a filter, a bottle of Palinka, a pocket knife, with a corkscrew, a torch, a pair of compact binoculars, bottles of water, various currencies, zlotys, dollars, euros, and forints, a couple of notebooks, 2 mobile phones, a power bar, iodine tablets, a towel, a sleeping bag, a pair of swimming trunks, a raincoat, a few shirts, and a stamped and signed documents saying that the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense agrees to my arrival and transport. You didn't wear any of the things, no iron dress shirts, no dinner jackets, no linen trousers that you might have done elsewhere. And I was thinking, when I was doing this, you say, maybe too much about Zelensky. The next time I travel to Ukraine, I may take a different approach. Uplifting elegance is appreciated, I've noticed, much like the way when you're at a festival or camping in the rain, you long for a hot shower and clean clothes. And what were you doing with all of this?
Well, now I bring other clothes when I go next time, and but it was I never had been in a country in war, so it was, and I was going there alone, and I don't speak Russian or Ukrainian, so I had no idea what I had to expect, and so I took all these very practical things with me. But what I noticed that even when times were very hard, all the nail studios and all the hairdressers were open, and all the ladies had beautiful nails, and so I think, especially in time when it is very tough, it's a way to keep the spirit up and to show that you will not give up. And it is mostly Zelensky who is always in a green T-shirt, but not everybody else. And I saw that all the world leaders coming to him often dressed then in the same way.
I'm going to make 2 points really, or ask, rather not end at all, but throw it open to the floor. The first is, you met really remarkable people who, like you, were either caught up with the war locally, or unlike you, or like you, had come in to involve themselves in some ways. The most interesting and remarkable character, I think, was a man called Neil. He's the sniper who's referenced in the title. Perhaps you could tell us about him, because particularly for the Americans who are here, he is a very interesting figure who has devoted himself really to the cause of fighting the war.
Yes, yeah. Well, you see him here. We traveled for nearly a week together through Ukraine. He is a U.S. Marine. He was in Afghanistan and Iraq, and he started as a young Marine in Japan. And but he was retired from the Marines, and he is having he's taking care of gardens in Alabama, and in a city there. He has a little company doing that. And when he saw that the hospital in Mariupol was bombed, that was for him he's a very religious man, and that was something that you bomb children and babies and pregnant women. That was for him a red line. And then he decided he wanted to go there. And he had to negotiate with his wife, because he wanted to go 6 months, but he could make a compromise with her that he was allowed 3 months to go there. And he went, and his church got together some money for his travels. And by accident, the first time I went on that night at the border in Poland, I crossed the border together with him, just accidentally. And then we stayed in contact. And when his time was over, the 3 months, I went to go and pick him up. But while he was there, he kept contact with me all the time. And Zelensky, I think on the 10th day of after the invasion, he asked people who had experience military to come and fight. It is the International Foreign Legion. And it works like this. When you enter into Ukraine over the border, there's 2 tents, one of United, what is it called? And one is from the Foreign Legion. And you have to go there, and then they bring you with a bus. You have to go to Lviv, and then you're picked up. And they found out most of the people are sent back immediately because they're romantic or suicidal. And but they saw immediately that he was a serious man, and they took him the next day to a shooting range outside of Lviv, and they found out that he was a marksman. He was a marksman with the Marines. And then they asked him if he was willing to do work for them, and if he was willing to kill people. And one of the things that he was doing was he was together with a young Ukrainian Marine. He went far into land occupied by the Russians to go after generals and officers, and that he was doing. But the most remarkable thing that he did was at a certain moment he rescued a baby, a 6-day-old baby, from an underground hospital in Mariupol. They went with 2 Marines, and that was I don't know by heart the date. I think it was in April, but Mariupol was already completely taken over by the Russians. And also the whole last 2.5 hours between more up north and Mariupol was mostly under control of the Russians. So they had to go. So they decided to go with an ambulance. So they found an ambulance this one. And they threw out all the medicines. And the 2 Ukrainian Marines went in the front with their Kalashnikovs in the door. And they put on the outfits of the ambulance personnel. And Neil was in the back. And there was a little hole between the driver and where he was. And so they put it full with ammunition, and they drove to Mariupol. And they succeeded in freeing that baby. And so it was 3 Marines with a 6-day-old baby having to drive 1,500 kilometers back. And I asked them who was changing the diapers, but they were taking turns. And but so these three men saved the baby, and it was adopted by an American couple, the baby. And the parents, the biological parents, were by a bombing in Mariupol were killed, and that's what.
Well, actually, one of the things which I, as a reader, always feel in books of this kind is I always want to know what happened to the people involved. And I remember one couple, your relatives, I think, Alexei and Yeva, who came out and stayed with you and your wife in Hungary for some time. They went off to Cannes. He had been a town planner, I think, important job, and he went to the south of France in order to become a chef in a smart restaurant. Do we know how that has gone?
Yeah, I had contact with them today, actually. Yeah, I think he was not so happy because he was thinking that he was becoming a chef, but it was more like baking pizzas. So it was less. I think he dreamt becoming a chef, but he's making pizzas, and he's a very clever engineer. Oh. So in the beginning, it was interesting to see how he could, in the best way, make a pizza. Yes, but after a week, he found out, and then it was repetition.
Well, he may not be exactly doing what he hoped, but he is in the south of France, so it's not a bad outcome for him. I'm going to throw it open, as I say, but one quick question. This is about the experiences you're describing of the first 6 months of the war. We're now coming up to 18 months, and so I have to ask you, have you changed any of your opinions in the course of the time, because the military situation has changed and so on, and the diplomatic one too? Have you changed any of your opinions? Were you changed by your experiences? Either of these things?
Yeah, I became a little bit more somber about. I was all the time very optimistic, but I'm afraid it will be a long war, and yeah, so that was the biggest change for me. I hope that, because the determination of the Ukrainians is so huge, and they work so well together, that I thought they will win, but I'm afraid it will take a long time, and now. It is worrisome how the Americans how they will continue in the long run, but further, yeah, what I think was interesting, because you mentioned earlier the Spanish Civil War, when so many young, mostly leftish people went there. To help. And the funny thing is that in some way, because I go with friends, and I'm 60 and my friends are the same age or even older, and we bring cars there for the army, but we meet Brits who bring ambulances, Germans who bring fire trucks, Norwegian parliament members who bring trucks, Americans who take out people to all private initiatives to have people operated and recover in the United States. So, but they are all a little bit people who are getting gray already a little bit, and they're mostly conservative. So it is funny. It is people who, it is the opposite of the Spanish Civil War. It is, but there is this amazing reaction in the Western world to help these freedom fighting people against, and I think it is all people my age who still know Russia. Yeah. Because I see the younger people are a little bit too woke for it. Yes. To see the danger. Yes. Well, the Hungarians are also a little bit too woke, I think.
Well, I think it might be the case too that if Neil, who is from Alabama, by the way, the man you mentioned, he's from Alabama, and if he were to go back and tell of some of his experiences and also what he's seen, that he might be able to make somewhat of a change in what's called the Republican base. But for the moment, he seems to be needed by Ukraine. I thank you very much, Jaap, and now let me throw open to the floor for questions. Yes, there's a lady here who's got a microphone, and she will come to you. Would you, the person who's going to ask a question, raise their hands? Thank you. Would you be kind enough to say who you are, by the way, yes, or if you have any affiliation to an organization?
I'm Andrew Ludani, and I taught political science for 40 years at Ohio Northern University. But I have moved to Hungary. Now, in my move here, I encountered one fascinating experience of Hungarian tradition, and that takes us just a moment back to 1848-49, when Gergely Arthur, the leader of the military forces of Hungary, puts down surrenders to the Russian and Habsburg forces because he realizes that the struggle is lost. In Ukraine, Zelensky does not have this capability to say it's time for peace. Because why does Zelensky not have that possibility of making that decision? Because the decision is in Washington, not in Kyiv. I have the feeling that as wonderful as your book seems to be on the personal level, in terms of defining the individual tragedies that we encounter in a war of this sort, the one thing that's missing, in my opinion, I haven't read the book, I just bought it now, so I will have a chance to read it in a little while, but from what you have said and the questions that were raised, I see a tragedy unfolding in which the Ukrainians are the main victims of this struggle, and there is no way of backing out of this unless peace comes to the area, and there is no Ukrainian leader at the present time who can make the type of decision that Gergely Arthur, or Arthur Gergely, made in 1849, that, hey, there's no way we can win this, so let's put our arms down and make sure that the Hungarian people have a genetic future because we don't lose all those young people. Now in Ukraine, the genetic tragedy is already there, not only in terms of refugee movements out, but in terms of the military losses that the Ukrainians have suffered and will continue to suffer, because in terms of numbers, sheer numbers, the Russians have a great advantage. Now, do you see any prospects for a Ukrainian Gergely Arthur to take a position on this when the strings are being pulled from Washington by major oil companies and by the arms industry of the military industrial complex?
Yeah, well, 90% of the Ukrainians want no concessions whatsoever. So it is not Zelensky or Washington who is saying this, but all the Ukrainians. So it's the Ukrainian people who want to fight. And they know because their wives get raped and their children get stolen, so they only can fight. And concerning Gergely, I think that you cannot trust the Russians and the Habsburgs, is that all the 13 generals were killed like criminals. And so I think there is this moment there is not, Moscow does not want any real concessions or peace. So I think the only thing that the Ukrainians can do is to fight on. And I think what the West is doing is, I don't understand neither what the West is doing, because I think we give them not enough weapons. The Ukrainians all want to fight, and I think we should give them much, much more weapons, and then they would win. So and if Zelensky would decide like Gergely, I think there would be a huge uprising in Ukraine now, because the people want to fight on. And that's what I see all the time also, but it is also shown by,
May I just ask the question? I mean, you make a very reasonable point, obviously. My question would be, what do you think at this stage would be the Russian requirements, demands for a peaceful settlement, a ceasefire, and then a treaty?
I think the Russians would be satisfied with territorial concessions, both in the east and in Crimea. I think the Russians are mainly concerned with not having Russia lose its territorial integrity. That is its main concern, and it has fears of NATO expansion. And from the coup d'etat of 2014 onwards, this became very clear, I think, to Russian leaders that, how should I say, the noose is tightening around what is Russian power and Russian national interest. And as a consequence of that, they initiated that war. No question, they are the ones who were the aggressors. But it's like in a schoolyard confrontation. Who throws the first punch, or who nudges the other one to a situation where they feel they have to respond. So I'm not saying that the Russians are completely at fault for the aggression they have created. The point, though, is that the situation has to be solved because of the losses that they will face. The Ukrainian, it's a proxy war. And in a proxy war, you are never going to win because you're just being used as cannon fodder. The people, how should I say, the powers that will benefit from it are third parties. They are not the ones who are engaged on the battlefront.
I agree that it is, well, it is a proxy war in that sense that the West is bringing these weapons, but it is the Ukrainians who decided to defend themselves when the invasion came. And it is all the time the Ukrainians who decided. So it is not a proxy war that is initiated by the West. The West was actually thinking that Ukraine would be defeated in a week or in 3 days, and only later decided that there was a chance that they could resist Russia. So it is not an invention by Washington that this war is fought. I think now the only thing that worries me is that we give them enough weapons to gloriously die, so we don't give them enough weapons to win the war. And I don't understand why the West is doing that. But in the same, I hope for everybody that this war will end as soon as possible, because it's clear, it's every day, sons and fathers and brothers are dying there. So it.
Yes, a question. The question.
It's getting serious, video. Okay, because this is a very interesting discussion, and I want just to throw in that I think one of the fears is among those who want to get to peace that this escalation will bring us to a third world war. So, into your opinion, how far should the West go if we are defending Ukraine interests? So should our sons and children go to war? How far do we go in this supporting Ukraine instead of going for a peace?
Well, I think now Ukraine, they have hundreds of thousands of people who want to fight, and I think they fight for us. And so I can only repeat, I think you should give them all the weapons they need to win the war. And I don't think you have to be scared for an escalation, because Putin, that is why he's trying to blackmail us with the fear of a nuclear bomb. But it is clear that he did not throw that all the time. And I think there cannot be any more escalation. They are torturing all the people. They are raping the women, and they are stealing the children to Russia. I mean, what else can there be escalated? And I think Putin is not suicidal. he just wants to stay in power. And I think he makes his own country so miserable that he has to all the time be imperialistic and attack another country to keep everybody focused on that they are in war. So I think, I think he only respects power, not weakness, and I think you should not try to talk with him. I mean, you have to hit him. I think you have to do that. Yeah.
Yes, the gentleman here.
I think the problem here is that giving back Crimea and the East is a non-negotiable for Ukraine. Giving it back by Russia is non-negotiable for Russia. And besides that, Russia has already stated that it wants more than they have now. So my question for the gentleman here is, what kind of deal can be made now by Washington and Moscow or other parties? Because I don't see the solution.
Can I just add to that question before I pass it on to Jaap and also possibly to the first questioner? Obviously, when the ceasefire is called, that line where the two armies are positioned is going to largely dictate the final terms of the treaty, isn't it? So the question would be, I think, particularly for the Ukrainians, it would be, well, no Ukrainian who is at present not governed by the Russians will want to be in a territory that is given to them. So there'll be no desire on the part there, and in other words, to give them any deal which takes new prisoners, so to speak. And for the Ukraine and for the Russians, will they accept less than they had in February the 22nd last year?
No, I have no idea. I really have no idea. Well, it is clear that at a certain moment they have to get to a compromise. And I think for the Russians to lose Sebastopol is a no-go. So I think in the end there must be a compromise. But my feeling was when the Ukrainians get a little further and they can start to isolate Crimea, I think then they are in a very good position to start peace talks, because then it looks very bad for. But then still, the war could also go on for another 10 years. But I think then they're in a position to discuss things.
Yes. Well, okay. Next question. Gentleman here, and then the lady there.
Stephen Klimchuk, I'm a visiting fellow of the Danube Institute this month. I also hold the rank of colonel in a NATO army. So obviously this is a tragic situation that has unfolded. It's very clear that Russia thought the Ukrainian troops would collapse very early on. They even had ceremonial uniforms for the victory parade. Also, Western sources thought that Ukraine would collapse rather quickly, which is why they were offering the chance for a government exile for Zelensky and so forth. I think what we're seeing now, I mean, we're all speaking about sort of possible scenarios for what happens now. Do appreciate all of your on-the-ground stories. But it does seem to me that, unfortunately, what we're moving to is not a compromise or a peace deal or peace treaty, but more of a frozen conflict, the kind that we see on the Korean Peninsula. That what we have now is the Ukrainians having their Western kit, Western training, not enough to push through the Russian defensive lines that have been built up. And it's at some point the Ukrainians seem to be running out of gas, so to speak, not able to punch through. So what seems to be the most likely scenario is that as we move into the winter and into next year, that we may have a kind of de facto frozen conflict where the issues on both sides are not actually resolved, but that we have a kind of frozen armistice. this is the opinion I'm hearing from many people who are very qualified to know about what's going on, and in many cases would like to see the Ukrainians win, but just a remark.
Yes, well, I can imagine that will happen, indeed. I hope that, because I think the West has this ridiculous idea that the weapons we give them are not allowed to use in Russia, although Russia is shooting all the time into Ukraine, that we take out that little, how do you call it, sanction on the weapons.
And the lady here.
My name is Clara Papp from Cleveland, Ohio, the United States. And first, let me begin by saying I admire your grit and your perseverance and your courage in seeing the war firsthand in Ukraine. I'm sure your wife must have been very concerned for your health and safety. But apart from that, I am very worried taking this perspective of what is happening in the United States. The Speaker of the House has just been ousted, and the continuation budget that Congress passed does not include support for the war in Ukraine. And they have until November 17th to come up with a new budget. And I, too, am very worried that the support for this war is, I don't know that the West has the perseverance to continue this for, as you say, 10 years.
Yes, and I think also that Vladimir Putin is convinced that he has more perseverance, and the Russian people have this huge, they're so used to have a horrible life, that, and in the West we're a little bit spoiled, that he can hold on longer, and it could be. What is your opinion about that?
Well, I think the great problem is that not only does anyone in Ukraine not want to find themselves living under a Russian government, so that nobody who is at present on the Ukrainian side of the battle lines will favor any kind of concession. And there will be some, of course, in the in Crimea and other places, who actually want the Russians to win. But I don't believe they're the majority, even so. But the real other problem is that the demands that are being made by the Russians in two respects are very hard for the West to concede. And one is, of course, that they are making what are fascistic demands, genocidal demands, in terms of how they will treat the Ukrainian population. And this is really shocking, and how can we sort of say yes to that in any formal sense? And in the second sense, Putin has actually demanded that the end of the Cold War arrangements that were reached and approved by the Russians, as well as everybody else, should now be reformed in such a way as to have a de facto retreat of NATO from the countries, including, incidentally, Hungary. Now, I don't think that's going to be conceded, but because it's very hard to, why would we concede that? Simply on the grounds that the Russians are prepared to carry on bombing and killing people, as we think, more or less indefinitely. Now, I'm not sure that that is correct, but I certainly think the nature of the Russian demands makes it very hard to reach peace. And the final thing is, you know, we've underestimated the Ukrainian army so far at every point. It is perfectly true, I think, Stephen, that the suggestions now is that they're batting their heads against a brick wall. But the fact is that they're not losing as yet. The Russians have not really won anything except Mariupol since the thing started. So I would have to sort of, you know, express, what's the word I want, agnosticism about what is going to happen as opposed to what I would like to happen.
But answering your question also, I think everybody is worried about what will happen, because the United States is crucial in this war. So we will. I'm hoping that they will not step back, but also that I think is a wake-up call for Europe, because I think the United States is much more focusing on China and Taiwan, and Russia is for us a danger, and so I think as Europe we have to find a way how to deal with that.
One final thing, Orban's idea of not bothering with whether or not you're going to have any kind of peace treaty, but simply saying, look, have a ceasefire, and then we'll wait and see. Because if you do that, you are in the frozen conflict world that Stephen described, but maybe that's better than the world we look like being in if that doesn't happen. So I would say, on that point at least, Viktor Orban has sort of pinpointed quite a clever way of ending the conflict. I'm under instructions to say that we have to end this now. I want to and then afterwards we can all go to the gallery, which is on this floor, but you go out and around, and that's where there'll be a glass of wine waiting for those of you who feel like a glass of wine, and one or two other things. So many thanks, Jaap. This has been a marvelous experience to have you able to describe what you saw and what you have returned believing about the conflict. I'm very, very sympathetic to all of the points you made. I enjoyed the book, sad and depressing though some aspects of it inevitably are. It's a fine book. I urge you all to buy it. I thank Jaap again, and I want to thank you for coming and having this discussion. Many thanks.
Yes, and then one... I love to speak with everybody and share thoughts, and to me, because for me it's very interesting how you all think about this and how this can end. And I will also sign books. That.